This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic. For a full range of audio, media buying, and creative services, including podcast production, check out trisonic.co.uk.
I just think it's really important that as more time does become freed up by things like ChatGPT and other AI tools, that we are quite intentional in focusing some of that freed up brain space on the human premium part, which is about how to present the story that really matters in a way that's compelling.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. At the heart of every media plan is the need to understand what a consumer wants. Wants from your brand, your product, how they want to be spoken to, and through what touchpoints. Michael Brown is the UK and EMEA head of research and insight and a senior managing partner at IPG Mediabrands. I recently sat down with him to understand how his craft of both qualitative and quantitative consumer research is adapting to meet changing needs of CMOs and how he's integrating AI into his work practice. Brown believes wholeheartedly that the human element is at the core of consumer insights, and he explains why it's important for media companies and brands to continue taking that into account. As part of our conversation, we also spoke about key insights trends, including the seeping of politics into social listening online, and what that means for brands who have demonstrated care or lack thereof to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. In addition, I spoke to Brown about how he and his team are handling any uncertainty over Omnicom's acquisition of IPG. This is our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Michael Brown, welcome to the show.
Jack, thank you so much for having me on. What a treat.
What a treat. We've known each other for a few years, and I don't think I've ever actually asked you the question, which is that I often ask to first-time guests on the podcast, and that is, how did you get into media and advertising in the first place?
Well, it's actually a kind of a slightly poetic in the context of what we're about to go through, our evolution at IPG at the moment into Omnicom. I used to look after Omnicom. That was my patch. I used to sell survey sample data to Omnicom Media Group. And I can actually vividly remember having a cigarette outside of Seymour Muse, which is where OMD used to be, back in 2011, I think it was, to have a big meeting with the global head of insight at Omnicom Media Group to pitch a research solution for some tracking. And that meeting ended up being incredibly fateful for me because the global head of insight at Omnicom Media Group is actually Jo Rigby, who is now my colleague at Mediabrands. She leads growth and marketing at Media Hub. And she's a close friend of mine. And it's thanks to that meeting and that relationship and Jo that I came into media, basically. And so, Omnicom has always been quite a big presence in my life, professionally speaking. And so there's a pretty cool symmetry, I would say, to the fact that that's where it all started.
And I'll ask you about the merger, or I think the acquisition is the correct terminology, in a little bit. But you've spent your whole career doing research and insight. And I'm curious if you think it's generally common that brands integrate that well into their sort of media business, or if they overlook consumer insight at all. I mean, what do you sort of view as the current status quo for what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, happily, I would say there's quite a few of our clients at IPG who are investing quite heavily in different programs of research. It varies quite a lot, from some of the more functional but very important research like brand tracking or campaign evaluation through to, and we've seen a really big surge in this second type of study, what you might describe as more strategically minded research like usage and attitude studies, projects that are quite large in scope and that are intended to get, I suppose, a definitive analysis of what a category or marketplace looks like, whether it is the auto category, which we've very recently completed for the hybrid and EV category, or parcel delivery lockers. Each of those projects has kind of yielded a kind of blueprint for what those marketplaces look like in 2025 and how to win.
What's changed? Do people bring in research and insight at a different time with regard to when they're considering building a media plan? When I talk to other research professionals, people often talk about, well, we need to make sure we're measuring from the start now and not just afterward. I mean, where does sort of consumer insight come into that?
I mean, I do think that we are much more upstream than what we used to be. I think historically, perhaps measurement has been a bit of an afterthought, but the relationships that we have with our clients at Mediabrands is quite daily communication with senior stakeholders, CMO level, and the conversations that we're having are quite strategic. And I think that probably explains why there's been such a big uptick in those usage and attitude type studies. So yeah, I guess it's kind of more of a strategic and ongoing relationship that we tend to have with our clients. When I kind of take a step back and ask why it might be that some of those projects are becoming more popular, I think, things are complex at the moment. The market is strained. There are economic pressures. Clearly, the cost of living crisis is wreaking havoc with quite a few different service and product categories. And also, I think there's another sort of crisis in the world of business, which is just information overload. There's so much data. I think it's probably being exacerbated to some degree by AI. I'm a big fan of the term slop in the context of AI, not least because of its kind of onomatopoeic nature of just sloppy information being slopped out by ChatGPT. But there's a lot of copying and pasting going on at the moment. And we all know that AI has raised the bar in terms of how quickly and straightforwardly we can access a kind of broad understanding about a topic. But I would say that investing in primary research is, it's a commitment to really getting a definitive, true understanding that isn't just broad, it's a deep and nuanced understanding of a marketplace or of different audiences.
Well, how do you use AI, if at all, in your day-to-day as a consumer insight researcher?
Yeah, so it's definitely a daily tool that we use. I'll mention some kind of classic examples where it's been particularly helpful. For qualitative research, so that's like what you might describe traditionally as focus groups or one-on-one interviews, depth interviews. Really helpful in two ways. So firstly, taking transcripts from conversations and interviews that have happened and yielding summaries of those focus groups. So let's say, like, for example, a project earlier this year into personal finance in the UK, we carried out 20 focus groups. Obviously, each of those last 2 hours, that yields a vast amount of data. So we use a tool called CoLoop, which then you can load up all of the transcripts data by labeling which different consumer groups or segments each of the focus groups corresponded to. You can query the transcript data and get amazing narrative, thematic analysis of what the content and nature and tone of those conversations was. It's an excellent tool.
And I assume you also use AI for the transcripts themselves to some degree.
Yeah, that's right.
I can. I did enough transcript writing. I do it for my job currently, but also when I was doing academic research, and it took me, probably 3 times as long as any of the conversations I had to write up, let alone analyze.
It's interesting during COVID when qualitative research transitioned from being the old school way, which used to be kind of traveling around the country, classically to places like Stockport, Glasgow, Newcastle. It was quite fun. You'd go on the road, the train trips were fun, stay in hotels, all a bit exciting, end up having just an outrageous amount of takeaways and very rich food. So you come back rather bloated. But, it was quite clunky. It was quite costly. And also the fact is, Jack, a lot of regular people, consumers, don't really want to give their entire evening to going to some freezing cold viewing facility in Stockport to go and share their points of view. It's all online now. And actually the merits of it are many. Like, it's practical. Anyone that's a parent or has got other caring responsibilities that wants to take part in a focus group can just dial on to a meeting link and then just be in the comfort of their own home, I was worried at first that it might impact the quality of some of the response data, but actually it's excellent and it hasn't done. I think the trick is all in the moderation to make sure that everybody is participating and that, people have the chance to kind of riff off of each other's points. But in my experience, the transition to primarily online qualitative formats has been quite effective. And like you say, just things like transcripts or recordings, like previously you'd have to pay a camera person to come and film your focus group, which would have cost like £1,000 or £2,000 in and of itself. So it's far more cost efficient to carry out qual now. And, qual, I love qual because it gives us just that human nuance, the emotional context in which behavior exists. So let's say, for example, cars and EVs and hybrid, without speaking to people, making them feel safe and comfortable to open up. you might not get into an insight like the fact that some female shoppers for that category don't feel particularly safe driving hybrid or EV in case the charge runs out when they're down a back street or on the motorway. And it just feels like a scary thing, like with a kind of blunter tool like, sales data or footfall data or survey data. You just don't get some of that nuance. So yeah, we've actually seen a huge increase, not just in UNA studies, usage and attitude, like I mentioned, but our demand for qualitative work has also massively increased over the last few years, which is great to see. Interestingly, AI in the context of quantitative data, by which I mean mainly survey data, hasn't been quite as impressive so far as it has been for qual. The quant data surveys, especially tracking surveys, can often exist in very large data files. It can be quite messy, the data, and the labeling isn't really that refined for effective use of AI, I would say, in many cases. And so I think AI is probably, we yet to see the best of AI in the context of quant data. But when it comes to qual, it's been incredibly helpful. The other aspect though, Jack, I guess, is just desk research. When you are going to start drafting a questionnaire, things like ChatGPT and other AI tools are incredibly helpful at giving you just very broad background and making sure that you don't miss things that are quite kind of relatively obvious. But it's interesting, I was lecturing last week. I lecture at Bayes Business School, City University, and I had a slide that I presented to the students last week, which was, what are the main methodologies when it comes to research nowadays? And for some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to put AI as one of the methodologies. I think it is critical as a kind of base, but I think that the actual true insight that you tend to get from it can be limited sometimes. There's something that's been on my mind recently, which is that, yes, tools like AI and ChatGPT are super helpful and it is a breakthrough. But actually, when it comes to the analysis, the insight, the narrative, the recommendations off the back of a research project, the thinking part, almost like a teapot brewing, the bit where that information sits in your brain, and the things that are the most relevant and important kind of float to the top. It's almost like a magic 8-ball, just when you're thinking on something and just the answer slowly manifests and becomes clear. That part is so important, and I would describe that as almost the human premium. That is what we as breathing humans bring to the equation. And I think that part for me feels more important than ever at the moment. And what worries me is that with the vast amount of slop and just how quickly you can get just too much information almost, it can slightly undermine the importance of that human premium.
Almost like some level of subjectivity on behalf of the researcher in terms of, this is what I think was most important from the conversation that I witnessed with the focus group, say.
Totally.
It is actually extremely valuable.
Definitely.
I mean, that's the reason why you hire a trusted researcher, because you actually want their expertise or their opinion about what they've seen, not just, here's what the transcript says and here's what an AI summarized what they said as.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, exactly. I always say that a great researcher, half of being a great researcher is having the technical and analytical instincts to be able to analyze a large data set, for example, to find the story in the data. But the second part of the battle is writing the story in a compelling way that is compelling enough to make your client care about it and take on board the findings of it. Half of it is technical and analytical excellence. The other half is storytelling excellence. And that human premium of what we bring is it straddles both of those things. So like, yes, AI is an important factor in making certain aspects of what we do a bit more quick and a bit more straightforward, enabling us theoretically to focus on some of that thinking and storytelling. But I just think it's really important that as more time does become freed up by things like ChatGPT and other AI tools, that we are quite intentional in focusing some of that freed up brain space on the human premium part, which is about how to present the story that really matters in a way that's compelling. One of the agency network groups, I think a quote came out from them saying that they see a future where media plans would leave agencies without having had any human contact or intervention. And I've actually talked to some of my clients about that kind of principle before, and it's just something that doesn't sit right with them at all. I think, that the role of people is absolutely essential, and it just worries me sometimes that we're clearly at the top of a hype cycle around AI, potentially, mirrored by other innovations before, like crypto, connected home, voice. I always say with voice, a quite sobering aspect on voice is that I can't even get Alexa to play what song I want to choose. And yet we were being told that that was going to be a kind of categorical shift when it comes to search, for example. It will be different because the richest people in the world are deeply invested in AI. But, we run the risk of talking ourselves out of a job. And it reminds me of, very different world, but had a conversation with a psychiatric nurse who specializes in treating patients with OCD. We're at a dinner party, and he was just saying that he's really worried that AI is going to put him out of a job. And actually, what he's doing is like he takes patients onto the tube and he gets them to lick like railings and stuff.
Come on, that doesn't sound especially healthy.
I think it's called exposure therapy, but it's something only a person can do. And it just shows, I guess, the patients that, they can do it and they overcame it and that everything was okay. And even that person with that incredibly human craft of helping people with OCD, even that person is freaked out about their job. So I just think we need to have a bit of perspective on AI, and above all, keep the human premium of what we bring to the table in absolute close sight.
You mentioned you have the ear of CMOs directly. What are their concerns today, and how have they changed over time?
I think getting to true insight, the insights that really matter to them, that is a bit of a perennial thing that is on their minds. But what's been interesting actually over the last year or so is that there's been a bit of a change in terms of some of our senior clients' preference in terms of how they take on board research. So classically, research agencies would pitch up to a debrief and present 100 slides, and then they've got another 150 slides borrowed away in the appendix. It's like a hit and run on a massive scale of just tons and tons of data. And actually, what we're seeing instead is that some of our clients would prefer to have less volume of research, actually less volume of field work. So let's say instead of weekly surveys, then monthly surveys, or instead of monthly, then quarterly instead. And a bit of a move to, I guess, a kind of less is more format of let's not be constantly racing around the data, trying to get our heads around what the latest story is each week, but actually let's take a more thoughtful, digested approach every quarter and just do a much deeper dive on how our brand is performing. But it's got some really interesting symmetry actually with the world of, I guess, published media, I would say. So Vogue and Condé Nast, for example, have reduced from 12 editions a year to 8. And I think the editorial vision around it is just, let's make these 8 really excellent. And
as opposed to the 12 that weren't as excellent.
I guess, as opposed to the 12 that maybe just had just kind of perhaps just content for the sake of content. Let's just make these 8 really intentional and focused, and almost like collector's items where they're almost of a quality of collector's, like a coffee table book kind of thing. I feel like in research, there's echoes of that for sure, where a debrief, for example, needs to be more editorial in terms of the way that copy is written in it. Recommendations are written in a way that sounds engaging. Our bigger debriefs always go past the design team because, like I said earlier, I think how you tell the story is just as important as the story that you're telling. And so I think, there's just some interesting kind of echoes. It also reminds me a bit of, the slow news movement like Tortoise Media, where rather than just having never-ending, frenetic, manic news cycle going on, you've just got a slightly more digested approach where clients would rather just make that time quarterly. Frankly, it can be a psychodrama just getting meetings into clients' diaries, as we know, especially for like a 3-hour affair for a great big chunky debrief. So just coming quarterly, let's say, and just saying, let's just make this a really thoughtful, action-focused, productive 3-hour session.
And it's not defensive in the sense of that sounds like you're technically doing less, not less work, but fewer meetings or fewer touch points. You don't feel defensive about that. You actually think, okay, clients, that's what they want, and we can deliver that to a higher standard.
I think it probably works well on both sides, really, because then we can streamline things like the fieldwork that's happening in the background, and just it's much more practical to focus on data analysis with a big meeting in mind a quarter away from now. Or, I mean, it could be that we do things in parallel, like, for example, have an automated dashboard, visualize data so that the client, if they need the data, we do that for some of our clients, they can log on to, say, a Tableau dashboard that's updated in real time so that they can see how their brands are performing. But then for the more interpreted, drilled down analysis, then it's more for the kind of set piece quarterly debriefs. It could be that's probably a bit of a best of both worlds hybrid, I would say.
A week doesn't go by where I'm not sent a emerging trends report of some kind. They're typically related to what's going viral online on different social media platforms. I'm curious, from 1,000 feet, what are some of the big emerging trends that you see just in terms of general consumer behavior?
Yeah, so it's a complicated one because I think overarching trends they can feel quite fragile. I think there's an interesting post I saw on LinkedIn recently by Charlie Abdi, the CSO at Omnicom Media Group, and I think Tess Alps, chipped in on it, which is basically talking about how media isn't as fragmented as we necessarily think that it is. It was highlighting the fact that the most watched TV series nationally last year was Gavin and Stacey, and the most watched TV series amongst Gen Z last year was Gavin and Stacey. So it's more about just how we consume content, devices, or where you are, when you watch it. That can vary. I think that's quite interesting. It ties to a point that feels like a perennial truth, which is that we tend to have more in common than that which divides us across generations and perhaps in other ways in society. In terms of where we tend to look for consumer trends, social listening has been quite an interesting goldmine historically, but sadly, territories like X have become obviously quite clouded by political debate and also just people moaning about late trains and cancelled flights. So,
and I imagine a lot of bots as well.
Yeah, perhaps some bot conversation going on there too. But happily, as well as some of the traditional social listening methods, we've now got Reddit, which has been serving us as a fantastic lens onto emerging just like interests, topics, trends, pain points. And so we've been working really closely with Reddit over the last few months just to embed using Reddit insights in the way that we service clients at Mediabrands.
How do you go about using that platform? Because I've been on Reddit for a very long time, and my Reddit is going to look very different from other people's because the subreddits that I'm subscribed to or follow are very different from other people. So if you're working on behalf of a brand, do you go into specific subreddits and do some social listening there? Do you look site wide? How would you even go about tackling a platform like that?
So it's a bit of a cheat, I'm afraid, Jack. They've got a special dashboard and platform and self-service tool, but I'm sure that if you ask them nicely,
if I ask them, I could have access to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just excellent. To be honest with you, as a non-historical user of Reddit, I think you're a long-standing user of Reddit.
I am, but yes, about 10, 15 years.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a relative newcomer, I would say. And so even the whole culture of subreddits and the culture that exists within each of them was a bit of a blind spot for me. And I'm afraid this is a bit of a stereotypical mindset that I had. I probably thought that the audience was nerdy guys.
Like me.
Not a loaded comment, Jack.
Okay. I'm willing to offer that up. Sure.
So, no, actually, if you look at their audience data, it actually indexes ever so slightly towards women, and it's very broad psychographically. Like, you get all different types of people and lifestyles. And so, yeah, this tool is brilliant. It allows you to click into subreddits, see what growing trends and trends in decline are, some of the main conversation points, if there's products in particular that are resonating amongst that audience. Yeah, it's been incredibly enlightening. And so I'm feeling quite optimistic about social listening insight just based off of this new goldmine that Reddit represents. It's interesting. Reddit as a search term is increasing lots. So if someone is looking for an air fryer, then it's getting more and more likely that they'll type into Google search air fryer Reddit just to get straight to the subreddit where people are digesting the intricacies and ins and outs of merits and setbacks of each of the different models. And that has quite big implications, obviously, in terms of how you approach search marketing, but definitely how you approach insight as well. Because if that information could be definitive and super influential in terms of what people decide to buy, then we need to be there to understand that conversation, and I guess just tapping into it to get for our clients as much insight as we possibly can.
Yeah, I definitely understand the value, even as a user, right? You're talking to anonymous people that are probably going to be very blunt and honest about their experience with products, right? I also, I work for a publisher, so I also understand why you like the other highly editorialized version of maybe product recommendations, like the classical version of sort of the open web where you type in a search and then you trust Wirecutter or something like that for a product recommendation. And there's positives to both of those, but it's definitely been an interesting use case. And I also add Reddit onto many of my Google searches, and that's just as much a commentary on my use or my lack of trust with Google search as it is a trust in perhaps a crowdsourced option on Reddit. Right? Which is really interesting. Do you think marketers risk leaning too far into trends or leaning too far into social listening? Because my understanding, and I've always felt that by the time you've done your social listening and communicated it to a CMO and then drawn up a plan about what you want to do in reaction to that, the trend's already gone. Like, it's too late. Some of these trends move so fast, especially on different social platforms, and you actually run the risk of being seen as not especially cool by maybe tapping into a trend that's already passed. It's the old, sort of, oh, my grandma's on Facebook type of thing, and that started happening, in about a decade or two ago. Right? Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think there's probably two different types of trends. There's more tactical, kind of flash in the pan, episodic trends that come and go. For example, the Oasis tour has been a big cultural moment, and lots of brands I think it was Aldi that activated around it, but there's just been quite a lot of brands just tapping into the energy, whether it's through wordplay. I think the Aldi one was something like Alde. It was kind of pronouncing Aldi in a Mancunian sort of a way. But then there's, I guess, more broader cultural trends that exist. For example, politics. And that's a dicey one at the moment, because obviously what we're seeing is, in certain areas, a kind of extremist move towards the right wing, frankly. I think we're a bit squeamish about taking that in the media industry because we tend to lean left ideologically. But I think we have to take that on board in terms of what audiences, where their heads are at nationally. I guess that extends to what media we consider using, which is an uncomfortable aspect of things. But we can't just ignore movements in where people's heads are at in society.
Even if it speaks against some of the values that brands have spent the better part of several decades now really sort of trying to work toward, in terms of maybe more progressive ideals or at least more inclusion. I mean, these are things that I feel like brands were a big part of over the past however many decades, and now suddenly it's either quiet or perhaps you're suggesting actually maybe brands should be showing up in more spaces that are certainly preaching the opposite of that.
So I think every brand and business needs to consider what are their values. And if the values are in a territory that you just mentioned there, Jack, about progressive, whatever that means for them, progressive is quite a subjective word for a lot of people. But I mean, we can safely say, to do with equality and safety and well-being for all parts of society, then I guess that there are questions that they need to ask themselves about how they want to invest their media budgets. A really passionate area for us as an agency group is purposeful investment and responsible media investment. And, that means working with publishers like Gay Times, for example, or Amalia, who we've partnered with before. And supporting cultural platforms that exist to represent and serve different communities in society. And I'm glad to say that we work with brands that really do value that. But what I would say, Jack, is that if a brand determines that their values are about supporting all parts of society, then the fact is that ideologically, as always with these things, the pendulum will swing again in the future. And whatever a brand's values are, I think it's important for them to be consistent, whatever they may be, because if in the future, or when in the future, the pendulum swings again towards a different ideology, then brands who have just muddled up and just changed their brand values, that inconsistency, I think, is something that will be quite conspicuous and potentially jarring for people.
I mean, I'm thinking of how many brands were changing their logos to a pride flag colors over the past several years and then didn't over the past year or two. Or how many brands preached, diversity and inclusion many years running, and then over the past year, basically since the Trump administration, frankly, came into office in the U.S., then suddenly said, actually, we're basically canning this idea. I mean, surely I know that this topic speaks directly to you, and that you care a lot about this. So, what's been your reaction, really?
My reaction mainly is to stay very active in the space, but active in the true sense of the word, actively supporting different charities that help different groups. I personally do quite a lot with Campaign Against Living Miserably. I'm on the fundraising board for United Nations Women UK. When it comes to DEI, I'm very involved with the IPA and the Talent Leadership Group, and with the Market Research Society, I lead their LGBTQ plus network. So I'm just very focused on doing. I think over the last few years, there's been quite a lot of emphasis in our industry on, I guess, performative and lots of talking aspects of DEI. And I think they're very important as well, because they're clearly symbolic statements of support. The challenge is, and I think weirdly, I think there's a parallel with AI as well, is that you kind of get to a point where there's been so much conversation and so much repetition of the same point that almost the language can start to become a bit meaningless, and you almost get a kind of lash back against it of just simple overexposure. The saying, over familiarity breeds contempt. Just that after having said and heard the term DEI and AI just a million times, people can just become a bit jaded by it. So I think, yes, visibility is important, and the rollback that you've alluded to definitely is real in many cases. I would say that I work with lots of brands at IPG where they are still very, very committed, and even so far as measuring on a monthly basis how much of their media budget they're investing into community media, like Gay Times. That's something that really matters to a lot of our clients.
They might not be as loud about it now. I mean, or are they willing to be as loud and proud about that?
I think perhaps they are a little bit more careful about some of the public messaging that they do about it. And you've obviously mentioned the reason why that might be the case, because of the atmosphere politically about it. And, if a big corporation is headquartered in America, then that does have implications about some of the messages that might be, coming out of the business. But I see the way that they are behaving and investing, and the conversations that they're having, and the things that they value. So I don't feel too discouraged at the moment personally.
You mentioned big American businesses. You work for a big American headquartered business, and IPG is getting acquired, assuming regulatory hurdles are passed, sometime this year, presumably, by Omnicom, as we alluded to at the start. I'm curious, sort of, assuming this acquisition does happen, first of all, how you have been handling the transition on a personal level with your team, and then also sort of what you expect to come from it going forward.
Wow. I mean, personally, not to sound too main character energy about it, Jack, I've always wanted to work for Omnicom. I kind of recently reached my 10 years at IPG, and I was just starting to think about, what I want to do with the next chapter of my career. And Omnicom was right up there. And then Perhaps I manifested it, Jack. Maybe the whole deal is about me.
Yeah, maybe.
I joke. But I'm super excited about it. I think Omnicom, like I mentioned earlier, it's always been just a very special presence in my world. I think when it comes to insight, they've always been incredibly innovative in terms of prioritizing and bringing new audience insight and thought leadership to the market. I think they have cultures that will be super complementary to ours. I see, for example, they're super active around the advertising associations, all in census and all of its accompanying work streams, around media for all, the multi-ethnic professional careers and community network. I think the agency brands are just wonderful, brands like PhD, Manning Gottlieb, OMD, and all of their respective leaders. So, and actually the community of research people over there are some of the people I most admire when it comes to my craft. So I'm feeling extremely excited about it. I mean, I won't lie, Jack, clearly not all of the finer details are defined at the moment. And so inevitably, undercurrents of, I guess, butterflies of what is it actually going to be like come up from time to time. But definitely the prevailing feeling is one of excitement. And it does feel like a new chapter is starting, which feels really cool.
Has there been any anxiety around sort of staff turnover, or, there's been a lot of media consolidation effectively over the past year, and not just at agency land, but also among many media owners. WPP had its own sort of agency brand consolidation that has led to, I think they cut back about 7,000 staff members. You worked at for quite some time. The UK MD, Kara Osborne, just left recently. It may have nothing to do with the deal. I haven't spoken with Kara. But does that give you or people on your team some level of anxiety amid all of this? I mean, some of it is directly related to your company, and some of it probably is just related to the industry that we're in at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, change can be a bit uncomfortable at times, Jack. I do think that just with the process, the transaction that's underway, I think it's been really clear both internally and externally that efficiency is not the prevailing driver for why it's happening. It's about bringing together the clout of our people, our data infrastructure, all of the different assets and qualities that we have, and combining what I think is going to be the most exciting and capable agency group ever. So yeah, I don't, that isn't like staffing cutbacks is definitely not one of the main reasons for it happening. But like I say, in any scenario where the future is not entirely defined, inevitably there are undercurrents of what's it going to be like. But we will see.
I know you're passionate about the culture of this industry. I think you might be one of the most well-connected people I know. I mean, not everyone is on the board of Soho House, for instance. And I do tend to see lots of social gatherings. And I mentioned it's been a turbulent year for a lot of people. Lots of uncertainty, lots of unknowns about what 2026 and onward is going to look like. Have you noticed any change to the social scene in this industry?
I mean, it's been a tough year in media land, just to state the patently obvious. And I think that the culture and social dimension of our industry, Jack, I think has been incredibly important this year at supporting people who have had changes of all different kinds. We'll all have seen different posts on LinkedIn of people sharing exits, for example, or changes in their career. And I think I would like to think that in all of those examples, there has been a friendship group and a network that has rallied around people and helped to connect them and find people towards their next opportunity. Our industry needs to nourish and protect, and it can feel a difficult task at times, one of the most special qualities that it has, which is the social dimension and fun, which of course I'm afraid can sound a bit frivolous, but I think back to when I left Cambridge, the different careers that I was contemplating, and advertising always stood out for me as one that was special for its creativity and the chance to spend lots of time building ideas and making stuff come to life, and frankly wearing jeans and t-shirts rather than TM Lewin shirts. But there's a reason why I didn't go into finance or law, and it's because I love the culture of the advertising industry. And for me, it's a culture that is largely built from friendships and fun. And post-COVID, and perhaps this is another obvious thing to highlight, work can become a bit transactional sometimes, Jack, where it's obviously largely screen-based. And I just think the importance of spending time together, and it's not just a return to office point, it's about spending meaningful time together. And clearly fun in 2025 is something very different to what it was in 1985, where it would have been quaffing carafes of red wine at the Ivy. But, you know, taking time together as a team, for example, to really check in with each other, you know, go up to the cafe and have 3 cortados and 5 matcha cookies or whatever it might be, or go for a walk, or, you know, lunches. I know lunch is a bit of a contentious territory for some people nowadays, whether it's, I don't know whether it's still the most effective way of spending meaningful time with clients, for example, but I just had one with one of our clients last week, and it was just the most spectacular conversation, just 2 hours. And the both of us, it moved around a bit over the last few weeks, but we finally found our moment and just shared so much, both from a business point of view and personally. And I just texted her this morning and said, I wish we could do that every week. And I just think moments of connection, and I guess it comes back to my earlier point, Jack, about the human premium, about just why are we doing all of this? Of course, it's to sell more product for our clients, but the daily journey, the process, the experience of our industry, I think we need to make sure that it's still anchored in what has always made it very special, which is people and enjoying the experience of doing it.
What's the most fun thing for you?
I know you laugh about Soho House. It's definitely not about drinking cocktails and champagne at Soho House. Honestly, for me, the most fun thing, one of the most fun things, is just Monday morning team meetings with my team and hearing what they've done over the weekend. I was just thinking about it on the way in this morning. Just, I love my team. I think they are so clever and brilliant people. And that is probably because we've hired them incredibly carefully. And so it's not about fancy stuff or flamboyant, bombastic stuff. It genuinely just having a coffee or just sitting with my team and sharing stories and hearing what's on their mind or what they're excited about, what they're worried about, and working through it. That is the singular part of my job that I find most meaningful and also often most fun, because it tends to be quite fun.
Have fun, retain the human element. Really great advice and a poignant way, I think, to end it. Michael, it's been a total pleasure having this conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, Trisonic. You can find all our episodes on the podcast platform of your choice or on our website at uk.themedialeader.com. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified of our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest news stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.